and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. Some 88 years ago, a writer by the name of Bruce Knight published a book called How to Run a War, How to Run a War, to warn essentially about Washington's ability to marshal all of the tools of the federal government to mobilize the nation for war. Written in a highly ironic tone, Knight was drawing on the history of the First World War in anticipation of the growing push for conflict in Europe, which, as we know, happened and probably beyond Knight's wildest nightmares in terms of costs, scope, and existential crisis. Our guests today, Christopher Coyne and Abigail Hall, have co-authored two previous books on the issue of the national security state, including Manufacturing Militarism and Tyranny Comes Home. Their new one is a fresh take on Knight's 1936 book entitled How to Run Wars, which is being released on June 18th. I was able to get a preview copy, and I'm very excited to talk about it here on the podcast. But first, let me formally introduce my guests. Chris is a professor of economics at George Mason University, the associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center, and the director of the Initiative for the Study of a Stable Peace through the Hayek Program. He also serves as co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and of the Independent Review. Abby is an assistant professor in economics at the University of Tampa in Florida and a research fellow with the Independent Institute, which is a nonpartisan research and educational think tank based in Oakland, California. Thanks for joining me today, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I guess I have to ask the first obvious question. Knight's book is kind of an obscure find. What drew you to it, and why were you compelled to recreate its style and that it reads like a long memo or a top secret comprehensive how-to for war planners and the national security elite?
I was giving a talk somewhere. I forget where, and I forget the person. I wish I remember. And someone came up to me after and said, you know, what you're saying sounds a lot like Bruce Winton Knight, someone I'd never heard of. And so I had to go look him up. And it turns out that he is the brother of the famous economist Frank Knight, who is a economist at the University of Chicago. And Bruce Winton Knight was a professor of economics at Dartmouth. And in addition to his books on economics, he wrote this book that you mentioned, and it was a satirical look at war making, trying to kind of pull back the curtain on what the realities of war making involve and entail, to get the reader to really wrestle with these nuances and really terrible activities that need to be undertaken in the name of war making. And so I was talking to Abby and I said, you got to look at this book. It's amazing. She read it. And then we decided that it needed a updating, but also that the satirical style was very effective for communicating these points to a broad readership.
Yeah. And I was taken aback because I'll be honest with you, I wanted to look up Bruce Knight, the original book, and try to get a sense of how it was written, why it was written. And I kept coming up on the Google searches to a New York Times review of it in December 1936. And my first impression was when I go to the New York Times and they say, here's a little synopsis of it, but if you want to go to the time machine, the New York Times time machine, click here. And I go there and it gives me, which is fantastic, the entire edition of that New York Times Sunday paper in which the Bruce Knight article appears. And my God, it's 149 pages, not the Bruce Knight article or review rather, but the newspaper itself. And it is an encapsulation of like what's happened in newspapers, because I mean, this thing was chock full with news and commentary and tons of stuff on what was going on the international front in 1936. So it was a wonderful window into, I guess, the importance that news in America placed on international and global affairs that you don't see today. But I'm digressing. So I was able to read the review as it was printed out on the page. And it just struck me that I think in hindsight, we assume that everybody, whether they were in the national security elite, in the sort of civic world, were all geared up in support for war. But in 1936, there was definitely a overhang, like Bruce points out in his book, from World War II, and that there was a lot of skepticism about how easily Woodrow Wilson's administration was able to whip up support for that war. And we've talked about war propaganda, for example, on the show just a few episodes ago with Brandon Buck. That there were skeptics. This wasn't, people weren't just marching lockstep into this war, into the Second World War.
Sure. And that skepticism really comes through in the original book. And I know one of the things that really struck me as I was reading it is I think that the time period is particularly unique because in 1936, you are firmly in that interwar period.
Yeah.
And a lot of our discussions and kind of analyses that look at or talk about sentiments regarding the war are either in that lead up to World War I or talking about kind of after the start of World War II. And so you're in a really unique kind of space here, where as someone who's reading it in a contemporary sense, you know what's coming next, but as he's writing this, he doesn't. And so there were a few things within that in terms of both his perspective, but also that skepticism that you mentioned that were really eye-opening for me, but also something that we felt compelled to, as Chris mentioned a few minutes ago, kind of refresh and bring that renewed skepticism.
Yeah. And I love, and I know that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you patterned the book similarly in terms of like how he separated or went through the different chapters in terms of how to run a war. And part one is the plea, and this is, I'm looking at your book now, a plea to the national security elite. And so maybe you could talk a little bit before we get into the different chapters, but if you could talk a little bit about why and why this is written with the national security elite in mind. Like, this is a playbook. Can you talk a little bit about this? I mean, you write, it is the unquestionable duty of the United States, your unquestionable duty, not only to uphold, but also to spread liberal democratic ideas around the globe. Are doing that not only secures our own interests, but also serves as a sort of inoculation against the ideas of our common political and ideological opponents. The only way this can be accomplished, however, as you know, is with proactive military forward foreign policy. So who is this audience that you're talking to?
Well, the book is actually meant for the general populace. So it's meant not for the national security elite.
Great.
But the way it's framed satirically is it's written by the national security elite. And the reason it's called the subtitle has a confidential guidebook is because the play is keep this secret. Don't let this fall into the hands of the general populace, or they're going to realize kind of your shtick. They're going to realize what's actually going on and what's required to run a war. And so it's satirical and it's addressing the national security elite. And we're saying, look, you're the most important thing in the world. You bring order to the world. You have to do this. And here's all the things that are required. And each chapter's a step in that playbook. And then at the end, we come back and say, now make sure this doesn't fall into the wrong hands, because if the general public picks this up and finds it, they're going to realize what you're up to. They're going to pull back the curtain and realize what's really required. And that's kind of the setup. So while it's addressed in words to the national security elite, it's actually meant for any interested, intelligent layperson who's interested in these issues.
Yeah, like somebody had stumbled upon it, or it had been leaked out into the real world.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about the playbook, and I feel like our viewers and listeners will be quite familiar with some of these. I don't want to call it tropes or tools of the trade, so to speak. But the first one is control the narrative. Can you talk a little bit about how controlling the narrative is a highly choreographed and critical tool of the government when trying to mobilize the populace for war?
Sure. So narrative is incredibly important. And there's a reason I think that we started the book with the narrative because so many things that come after that require to have a well-defined kind of consistent narrative on the part of the national security elite, because ultimately if you are wanting to engage in foreign policy, it requires some semblance of uh, acceptance or even like acquiescence of the general public. And so within that first chapter, we really talk about the importance of that narrative crafting. And one of the things that we do within that chapter, as well as the rest of the chapters in the book, is we draw on a variety of different historical examples to discuss how historical administrations have worked to craft that type of narrative to not only generate support for, in this case, US foreign policy operations, but also to maintain support for those operations. So we talk about things like the Bush administration and its sales pitch, for lack of a better phrase, to the broader public in terms of the invasion of Iraq. And then later talking about the change of that narrative, or how it is that you, as a national member of the national security elite, might have to adjust your narrative, and how you then make and sell those adjustments after the fact.
Chris, I'm thinking, and we don't have to get into the politics or how you feel either way about this particular conflict, but with Ukraine and the ongoing U.S. policy in Ukraine, it sort of follows the narrative that has been used over and again over the last 70 years, that the United States is the leader of the global rules-based order. We have an authoritarian government that has invaded a sovereign nation. It is up to us to be the sort of standard bearers of democracy. You've heard the trope, the democracies versus autocracies. Is that a narrative? And what happens if that narrative falls apart, where if it pushes too hard on the idea that Russia, say, is the evil scourge, if it's not, if it's not dealt with, that somehow darkness will befall the globe, but then at some point there has to be negotiations. How do you shift that narrative so that we could say, well, I know he's evil, but we got to end this war and we are going to have to talk to him. Does this shifting that these narratives sometimes put, I guess, the United States into a rhetorical trap? And Abby talked about adjustments. Is this one of those cases where adjustments may have to be made to a narrative that had initially gleaned support for the conflict?
Yeah, one of the chapters in the book is never admit failure, and that's the way the U.S. political elite deal with this, the national security elite. And you see this in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. And you'll see it in Ukraine too. And you already have started to see it, which is that the narrative is shifted on multiple margins. One of them is, for all of these interventions, it is very unclear what victory means. So on the one hand, we're told we must intervene and we must win, but it's never quite clear what victory means. And that's nice from the perspective of interveners, because they can continually shift what that benchmark is. Yeah. So I imagine what will happen is at some point, negotiations will take place. And you're already seeing some of this already with U.S. government officials pressuring the officials of Ukraine to at least start thinking about what that's going to look like in terms of negotiations. Where that goes, I'm not quite sure. We'll have to see. And I don't think anyone knows. But I imagine victory will be declared no matter what. When you're in that position, it's quite nice because you can never lose. It doesn't require you to take any kind of responsibility, and it doesn't require you to adjust or adapt the broader foreign policy itself or the narrative surrounding it. And one of the issues with the narrative of the world's police is, on the one hand, it allows you to do whatever you want, whenever you want, under the guise of that, because it is literally all encompassing by definition. But it also provides you with insulation from having to take responsibility or from having to rethink the grand narrative itself, because that's taken as a backdrop. And one of the things that Abby and I want to push readers to think about is questioning that kind of overarching narrative itself. That is both, what does it require to police the world and bring order to it, as if that can be done through some kind of top-down plan, but also, why is that taken as the way things have to be? And what might alternatives look like? And why don't we have that conversation to think about what those alternatives might look like?
Absolutely. So one of the chapters is controlling the media, which is one of my favorite subjects, because I see personally how critical it's been in terms of mobilizing support for a war. But can you talk a little bit about how organized an effort it is to control the media? And I know you've done tons of work, research on this, so I would love to hear how the lengths, I guess, the government would go to controlling the media. And what does that mean in a country where we do have ostensibly freedom of the press, and we assume that our media is not so easily controlled, certainly in an overt manner. So can you maybe describe for our video watchers and listeners what that actually might mean in practice?
So in this chapter, we cover quite a lot of ground, and this is also a topic that we have addressed elsewhere. So in our book, Manufacturing Militarism, we spend a lot of time talking about this topic in particular. So I'll offer a few different highlights. So as you mentioned, the media is a really important check on government. And one of the things that we discuss in this, again, taking the perspective that it's a playbook, is, well, it's really important then, in order to kind of capture the media so that they are delivering your message in a way that it is received and then accepted by the broader public. And so we talk about a variety of different ways in which that occurs, again, drawing from history to talk about what this looked like in various contexts in the past, but also in a more contemporary sense. So we talk about a variety of different tactics or tools that have been employed in recent conflicts to try to shape or otherwise alter what it is that the media is reporting. So we talk about things like embedding in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is the process of essentially placing reporters within military units in order to get them to report on the war. And if you think about this from an incentive perspective, the problems with this become very clear very quickly. Because when you are embedded within a group of people, you're going to, first of all, develop a rapport with them. And so you're going to be disinclined to say negative things about people that you like. But beyond that, they're also responsible for your immediate physical safety. And so, again, disincentive to report things potentially accurately. But then beyond that, negative reports means that you may very well get pulled out of the field. You don't have access to things that other journalists have access to. And so it's really limiting in terms of career opportunities. So we discuss a variety of those different methods. But the other thing that we talk about in this chapter is some of the other ways, so different types of media that people might not think about, which we consume on a regular basis. So things like film and television. So one of the things that my husband and I really like to watch are cooking shows. And much to my surprise, in starting to research this, you find out the following information. Things like cooking shows, Say Yes to the Dress, which, if people aren't familiar, is a show where people are trying on wedding dresses.
My mother loves it.
These types of shows oftentimes will actually receive support from the Department of Defense. So if you see Gordon Ramsay, flying in or coming in on jet skis to an aircraft carrier, how did that come to be? Well, that's providing messaging for the Department of Defense. In some cases, for the cooking shows, it looks like contestants, preparing meals for members of the armed forces. But in the cases of things like films, we see things like the following dynamic. Let's say that I, as a film producer, want to make a movie about war or conflict. If I go to the DoD and I let the DoD review and make suggestions on my script, then I can receive equipment, space, potentially military personnel to support my film. But I have to allow them a say in an editorial process. And if I don't, then it's going to be really difficult for me to make my film. And so this is yet another way that we see that narrative that gets crafted very carefully as being put forward to the public again in a way that many people are not aware of.
Yeah, I remember when Zero Dark 30 came out and everybody was anticipating how it would approach the actual torture that occurred on the CIA black sites during the global war on terror. And there was much disappointment because it was so overly nuanced as to completely lose the punch and the veracity of reality. And from what I've read afterwards is that the CIA was heavily involved in reviewing and assisting and consulting on that film. And I'm sure the producers and directors and screenwriters didn't care much because they weren't coming from our ranks. It didn't seem as though they really wanted to do an accurate depiction of torture and the global war on terror. And maybe they did at first, like you said, Abby. And then once the government starts getting involved and they say, well, if you want this and you want that, then you're going to have to, polish this off or soft soap that. And I think that's what happened. And it turned out to be a kind of a mushy movie that lost any zing or any real morality tale that could have been, unfortunately. And I'm sure there are plenty of other examples in that genre, but I think you're absolutely correct. And on the embedding issue, I'm so glad that you brought that up and that you're bringing it up in the book, because I think we've forgotten the people who had been around and were writing and reporting and researching during the Iraq War, particularly at the beginning when all of the news organizations had embeds in there and they were bragging about it because it's like they had been invited into some exclusive club. We have reporters on the ground. And what came out of that, like you mentioned, was a situation in which not only were these members of these news organizations identifying more with the soldiers than with the bigger picture of the war, they stopped questioning. So everything was about a particular tactical maneuver, a battle, the stories about specific soldiers, and not really questioning the strategy that was being engaged there. And that was absolutely deliberate. And David Petraeus would practically, I'm sure he did say it very distinctly, that they didn't want to make the same mistakes as they did in Vietnam, where reporters were allowed to just go in there, and at their own risk to cover the war. And they would embed themselves, if, they would attach themselves to units. And so, and we got incredible reporting, but the images that came back contributed to the anti-war movement back home because they were so real and so visceral, and they weren't soft soaped and they weren't filtered. So I think that the military, I know the military deliberately controlled not only when the first Persian Gulf, where they controlled the images, but with the Iraq and Afghanistan war, where they controlling the media itself and what it could report and how that could report on it. So I'm glad you're bringing it up, because I'm not sure we've entirely learned that lesson. I know this is something that you guys have written extensively about. You talk about sacrificing liberty in the name of liberty. Can you talk a little bit about how you handle that in this how-to book?
Yeah, well, one of the hallmarks of war making, certainly in the United States, but throughout history as well, has been to kind of the leaders set it up as either a costless exercise, so you can have security but won't have to give anything up, or as a necessary trade-off, so that, look, in order to protect liberty, you have to sacrifice some liberty, but don't worry, it'll just be a short-term phenomena, and all will return to normal, if not be enhanced and extended in the future once the war-making effort is over. But it never seems to work out quite like that. That is, the war-making effort is undertaken, and it's not that certain elements of the war-making apparatus don't shrink or are pulled back, but there's always residue left over, and that residue lasts forever. You simply just can't undo it, because if we think of the social fabric of life, and that fabric is, of course, quite nuanced. There's an economic component to it, a political component, a social component, and a legal component. So what you have is you get changes undertaken in the name of war making. And of course, war making is the major threat to constitutional rules, checks and balances, and legal constraints on government. You'd be hard pressed to find another set of activities that both pose a greater threat, but also empirically lead to throwing off the chains that are placed on government to curtail abuses of power. And what you get then is a permanent change in the relationship between the state and the citizenry. And you see things like that, for instance, with the Espionage Act. So the Espionage Act, passed in 1917, sits on the books for decades until the Obama administration decides to dust it off and use it to combat leaks, use it against journalists, whistleblowers, and so on. You get things like the surveillance state, which again has a long history. We think of the NSA today, but the history of the surveillance state goes back much longer. And it's not like anyone initially set these things up with some kind of forward-looking, I want to set this up in 1917 or what have you, so that we can have tyranny in the year 2010 or 2024. But you can be sure that when there's a rule on the books, when there's something that allows government to expand its power and to exert and broadcast control over other human beings, at some point in time, it will be used. And so one of the main takeaways of the book is to tread carefully. It is to grant government power to protect your liberties, which is always the promise. The promise is always, you must grant us additional power now over you for your own good. That, again, was the war on terror. That was George W. Bush, both in the war on terror, but also the financial crisis. We need to suspend capitalism in order to save capitalism. But of course, no one ever seems to recognize the irony in these things. That is, in giving those very things up, you're giving them up. And very rarely are you ever going to be able to get them back. And so the satire in the book is, you need to prepare the sacrifices. You need to prepare the people and prime them to be willing to give these things up readily. And there's a variety of ways you can do that, as we suggest in the book. Again, trying to warn the reader, hey, once you give these things up, they're gone. So be careful about it.
I'm going to ask this, and put you on the spot, Abby, but can you think of a current national security state reality, an impingement on American freedom that was instituted after 9/11 that is still keenly felt today, that maybe Americans don't even realize that it's still kind of hanging around and not going anywhere? I mean, is there, because I know, as you know, this is something I follow every day, but most Americans are like, yeah, that war is over. It's been 20 years, but is there anything that's really had a long shelf life that it just becomes a reality of American society?
I think in the post 9/11 context, there are a lot of different changes that we still observe today, which are either contemporary or recent or artifacts of recent history. And again, we've talked about these things not only here, but in other places as well. We spend some time in this book in particular talking about the TSA, which is absolutely a post 9/11 war on terror creation. Again, with this idea that, hey, you're going to have your person and property subject to potentially very intimate search whenever you go fly. And all of this is done in the name of protecting your safety. But the data that we have on that suggests that that is fundamentally not the case with respect to the TSA. The things about surveillance that Chris mentioned, you had a great expansion in surveillance powers in the post 9/11 period through the Patriot Act. All of their places that we might look would be things like the use of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones domestically, but also things related to policing and police militarization, which are also intimately tied to this period in the war on terror. And so I think that there are a lot of examples. Now, the break is not exactly a clean one, because it's not as though we didn't have surveillance, UAVs, or trends or concerns maybe related to policing and police militarization prior to the war on terror. But that's definitely a really critical inflection point and a place where we see a lot of expansion. And my guess would be, as Chris mentioned a moment ago, there are things that were passed and implemented after 9/11 that we might not see the full consequence of those policies for potentially decades, because those policies sit on the shelf and then they get used at a later point in time.
So we're running out of time, but I definitely wanted to tackle one more chapter where you talk about silencing dissent. Can you talk a little bit about what that chapter does in terms of the how-to method, but also, how does it reflect and what's going on today?
Well, we already touched a little bit upon things like surveillance and monitoring. So that's the covert way of doing it. But governments, certainly the American government, and this isn't recent, this is throughout wars in America, whenever there's a war effort, irregardless of the magnitude of it, there is always an effort to engage in what I call patriotic collectivism. That is, in order to pull off war making, you need the consent of enough of the populace to either willingly come aboard or to be indifferent to your actions. And that's where the collectivism comes in. And so, again, another irony here is that in the name of supposedly protecting individual freedom and dignity, war making, the exercise itself is collectivism in the raw on a whole variety of margins. And one way you silence dissent is to rally people around patriotism, what it means to be a good patriot, to support the country, to support the troops, to support broad, undefined categories like freedom and so on. And of course, all these things always entail supporting the national security state and whatever the national security state is doing. And then, of course, there is an enormous set of rituals that are undertaken in order to both create and reinforce this patriotic collectivism, from things like ribbons that people wear to sporting events and the various opening ceremonies at sporting events, and so on down the line. All of these things place social pressure on people to fall in line, or else you are framed as part of the outgroup, the others, those that aren't supporting the effort. I think that's important because while we have all these efforts, and certainly during, of course, Vietnam and others, you saw much more proactive efforts to silence dissent, whether it was infiltrating anti-war groups, civil rights groups, whether it was breaking and entering into the various private property of people associated with these movements, in some cases arresting them, planting evidence, and so on. You do have these more mundane actions that I think many of us neglect and don't pay attention to. But it's important to, because an alternative view to the collectivist patriotism is individual patriotism, which is that you can love what your country stands for as an individual, but be quite skeptical, if not outright disdain, the actions that are undertaken by the state that represents that country. And recognizing that distinction is not a mere rhetorical move, but rather one of crucial importance to ensure that what you value about your country sustains through time.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I had a sticker on my car when I was in college, and it was, "I love my country, but fear my government." And I'm like, that distills how I operate. Like, my operating system was that I love my country so much that I want it to be the best that it can be, but that the government was not reflecting the best that it could be. It had nothing to do with whether I was patriotic or not, is whether my government was actually working effectively for me. Yeah, and it's very disconcerting because I feel like the government, the ruling elite, the national security elite, deploys smears to also shame and cast a chill on dissenters. And I specifically note, the attacks or this idea that we must engage in anti-disinformation campaigns, i.e., people who are writing about Russia or have been enthralled by Putin so much that they are casting out misinformation about the war. And really, you have people who are just skeptical of the U.S. policy in the Ukraine war, being called Putin stooges or pro-Putin, whatever you want to call it. And I think that puts a chill on others who might want to question the policies, but don't want to be put in a camp with an autocrat or be considered anti-democratic, anti-American. And so I see that also deployed as a tactic to squelch dissent. And I think it's been very effective over the last several years as well. So, I mean, we didn't even get to many of the chapters here, which also include ignoring international law. You mentioned do not accept failure, embracing top-down economic planning. So I'm just going to have to tell everybody, get this book. It comes out on June 18th, and you can pre-order it. And I just really appreciate you guys coming on and talking about it. And I hope you'll come back on Trip the Beltway Fantastic in the future, because I just love your work.
Thank you, Kelly. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.